Okay, the second talk is more technical. The first one, the organizers are asked for a general talk, a general topic. This one is very particular on how to test contractual rigidities, but I think the technique that is used may be also applied to your research. So bottom line, out of a library of documents, you can construct data sets, unique data sets. So let's talk about public contracts. When you talk about public contracts, what is your first impression that comes into your mind? It's always something bad. Public contracts are very complicated, they're inefficient, low quality, there are delays, there are inefficiencies, political concerns, yes, this is driving everything, so it's always bad. But why is it so? So the literature has been focusing on information asymmetries, so this is more in an I/O spirit, or that the public sector is so different that they have different values, and this is why we do things differently. Because we are the public sector, we have different values than the private sector, so this is why we do things differently here. Or a third thing is, it's always because there is either a capturing story or an interest group story that is behind, and this is why public contracts are inefficient. This is why public contracts are more complicated than private ones, because that story is not relevant in a private-to-private relationship. I told you that every good presentation has a good picture. So here is the picture of my QJE paper. If you remember this picture, this would solve it. Imagine I'm not married, but as an academician, as an economist, I can do research about marriage, correct? We economists know everything, so we can do it. So imagine that I will have a model of a loving husband, loving wife, and they have a relationship, a contract. How would that contract change when I put the mother-in-law into it? I'm not saying that the mother-in-law is always bad.
Oh, that's wrong.
What I'm saying is, assuming the mother-in-law of is too much an assumption. And guess what? All the contract theories assume the mother-in-law is not present. We do not have the interest groups or the political opponents into the picture. So who is the mother-in-law? Is the one that is not necessarily interested in the successful of that relationship. That may be interest groups, political opponents, somebody that is interested in disrupting that relationship. Because the cost or the losses of the parties would be her gains somehow. So let's try to model that in a political setting. Sounds good?
Yes, very good.
So how would that contractual relationship change my paradigm of a contract, of a public contract, when I put the third parties into it? So a very short model, and without math, as Sasha was saying, just imagine that we'll have the preliminaries. We look into the public agent perspective. So I'm concentrating on the public agent, which is the one initiating and terminating the contract, the public contract. For simplicity, let's imagine that this is a very simple short-term contract. So we don't have a hold-up problem here. And we don't have an expropriation problem. And we have 4 players, not 2 players, 4 players. The incumbent public agent, the private contractor, the third parties, and the mother-in-law, the political opponents, and the public at large, which empowers the third parties. So the third parties can act because there is a public at large. There is a court, after all. And this graph summarizes the paper that went to QJ. So the blue line is how the third parties see the possible outcomes of a challenge, and how the public agent sees the possible gains of the third parties from a challenge. So if it's distributed stochastically in a normal distribution. So if the litigation costs are that high, the third parties will challenge a contract whenever the possible gains are higher than the cost of the challenge. The cost of going to court, the cost of finding some irregularities in the contract. What happens when I put more clauses, rule-based clauses into the contract? More rigidities, more contractual specificity. On the one hand, the courts are going to rule more in favor of the public agent because now it's more specific, the contract. It's harder to find some irregularities because you play by the rules. You play very bureaucratically. That may be inefficient. We're going to talk in a while if it's efficient or not. But we are talking about the court. So the first move is when I put more rigidities, I move to the red line. That means at any point in time, the possible gains for the challenger are lower. As stochastically first ordered, move to the left. But also, the cost of a challenge rises because now it's more costly to read 1,000 pages contract that is very rules based than just a page where you say, oh, I will make a new highway. So it's more difficult to find irregularities. That makes the cost of a challenge higher. So the probability of being on the right side of the distribution, the probability of having a benefit higher than the cost of a challenge diminish. If you plot all these points of higher rigidity and the probability of being challenged, your political expected cost diminish in rules, diminish in rigidity.
This is cool. It seems like the sort of thing that happens in Russian procurement auctions too. So in a way, so the externality is still present, so that solution is still going to be inefficient, right?
Say that again?
So this increase in rigidities and rules, if you can think about it like making the contract really unbelievably complex, creates an externality to the public at large, right?
Exactly.
But this is done...
But that externality, who pays?
Right, it's the public who pays, but this is done...
Pay.
Right.
Excuse my French. This is a CYA, theory of public contract. Cover your ass.
Yeah.
Theory. I mean, I cannot call it that in the paper. But this is how I pay the insurance. I mean, you are paying my insurance, my political insurance, by making it more complex, more rigid, artificially bureaucratic.
Right, but so because there's also the effect that if you make the contract very rigid, fewer bidders, if you like, enter to the right, are actually eligible.
And I will show you controls where these specificities are not tailoring the, you still have a very competitive market.
Okay.
Because you are tailoring it in arbitration clauses, in legal clauses. This is not design, this is not certification that you are increasing.
Okay, so this is not sort of, I'm trying to exclude all the people.
I'm not trying to exclude bidders.
This is only thinking what's going to happen
I'm saying that
after.
if you miss one day in the delivery, that's the penalty. In a relational contract, you'll have that in a relational term. Oh, you want the delay, telephone, I will give you this supply tomorrow, no problem. You cannot do that in public contract because you will be challenged of misuse of public funds. And you have to put that into the contract that you cannot deliver one day later. And there will be that sort of penalties. So these are contractual clauses, and I will show how to capture that do not preclude a competitive bidding market. So these are not specifications, tailored specifications, or designative specifications, okay? These are...
How related is this to the literature on optimal bureaucratic rigidity? So there's the whole literature on decisiveness versus...
so this is the Prendergast literature on public administration.
Yeah, and others have done this work, right? About the fact that you can increase state capacity. I mean, you can basically make it so government can respond perfectly to everything, but then you essentially make it quasi-dictatorial, and it's also unstable given it in democracy. And so, in some sense, the second best stability comes when you have a mix of a certain degree of rigidity that provides some credible commitment for all administration. That's the that's the justification
yes, the
for
optimal red tape literature.
So you have like a professional civil service, because otherwise, imagine if each government could literally start from scratch and then just do everything perfectly. Well, then there's no stability and no credible commitment.
Yes, to the extent to that I know that literature, and probably not that deep as you are, is that here is the political motives. It's not the red tape, the optimal red tape, it's how that evolves into the optimal point given the political constraints. So we are going to look more into the how the third parties, the ones that are not part of the public administration, affect the dynamic of the bureaucracy. One of the discussants of this paper once said, oh, you can relabel this as a the dynamics of bureaucracy, how bureaucracy arises and gets to an optimal level. So why a bureaucracy is bureaucratic, basically, how it becomes bureaucratic. So again, this was showing the previous lecture. Here is how it comes. The more I put rigidities, I lower the political cost, but I raise the contracting cost, because it's more costly to make that contract. And there may be an optimum level of rules, an optimal level of rigidity, of bureaucracy. The point is how to test that theory. The paper is very nice, has a lot of anecdotal evidence, but everybody can say, oh, show me the, how you can prove it. Because it's your theory competing with another theory. So what we did is try to get into contractual analysis by clustering words and giving the credibility with analyzing large numbers of contracts. So it was shown in the literature that the cost of writing a contract arises, the cost of, you have a trade-off between interpretation and contract writing. It's more complex to write a full contract, but you may have lower interpretation cost in a trial. So there is a trade-off. Also, that there is a positive correlation between complexity and the probability of the parties of choosing arbitration. More specifically, in the 2 years ago, Schwartz and Watson did a large word analysis of contracts that are embedded in the filings of the Stock and Exchange Commission. So let me talk a little bit about the Stock and Exchange Commission. The Stock and Exchange Commission demands for every contract, for every company, every quarter, to fulfill a 10Q, and once a year, a 10K. This is what you probably know from the CompuStat data set. You have the financials. Well, besides the financials, there are other exhibits that should be submitted. One of these is Exhibit 10, which are contracts. Contracts which are fundamental to the understanding of, to pricing the company. So if a company buys a large asset, it should be disclosed, and the contract should be disclosed. If the company has a managerial arrangement with a particular executive, and that affects the valuation of the company, it should be also disclosed. So these contracts are disclosed in text, so it's not a data set. It's just a piece of a PDF or just a text. But it's in the filings of every company. So what we try to show is how, analyzing those contracts, we can test for different rigidities according to the industries. We have a couple of hypotheses, very simple. So the first one is, Public contracts are going to be larger than private contracts. If they're supposed to be more rigid, more complex, well, one measure is length, correct? A second measure is they will have more specific clauses. More frequently, not only more, but more frequently, the certain clauses related to rigidities, to rules, will appear with higher frequency. And third one is that amendments will happen more often in public contracts, whereas the public agent, the private agents just may have a renegotiation on the phone. Public agents may not do that on the phone. You have to write it down because somebody may contest you that you are discretionally using funds. So to avoid that, we'll have it written down. Therefore, amendments will happen more often in public contracts. Written amendments, which is the one that you can trace and document. So here comes, I should have put the red revolution, but this is the credibility revolution that comes with textual analysis. I will show the example how we did with contracts, but you may think of your own research. How can you contract now data sets out of thin air? And this is done very simply using Python. I mean, the whole technique here, Python. Python is a language, a coding language. So I have my little code, which has no more than 200 lines, to read contracts. Well, to read documents. PDFs, for instance. You give me a library of PDFs, data set. And then you can compound that with some company characteristics, and you have, wow, voila, a novel data set of something. So we did that with 100,000 contracts. So we are talking big numbers here. And now I'm redoing the project with 1 million contracts. So we...
And just Python 1 million contracts.
You just Python 1 million contracts. I'm Pythoning. Okay, I'm Python. It takes a lot of time, but I'm Pythoning 1 million contracts. And company identification is the CIK, which is a unique identifier of the company. And by that, you can relate to the sector code, which is the SIG code. And you have the company characteristics and the contract characteristics for each company. So the big numbers, out of 100,000, we ended up with something like 16,000 contracts. And we almost 800,000 words we read over there. This is how you teach a computer to read. So we clustered several specific words that would mean arbitration, certification, evaluation, litigation, and all the changes. So for instance, it's not only arbitration, but arbitrated, arbitrary. You can code very specifically what sort of changes you want in the word. In Python, this is called a dictionary. And this is exactly what it means. How do we learn a language? Using a dictionary also, or some sort of translation. This is how you teach the computer how to read contracts. How the computer is going to learn to read contract language with these dictionaries. So the dictionaries themselves are part of the contribution to the science. So my two biggest contribution, I think, is the mother-in-law picture and the dictionary.
I'm sorry, I have a question. Do you come up with these words like ex ante from your head, or is it kind of a result of some clustering algorithm on your contracts and it is achieved?
Okay, very good point. There are two ways of constructing these dictionaries. One way that I did is I came up with a list, and later you go to a lawyer and says, oh, does this make sense? You, expert in contract law. Does it make sense? And say, yes, this makes sense, it doesn't make sense. So part of these works were done by Schwartz and Watson. and they only accounted for, I think, 11 or 12 words, and then I'm without any category, so they only have one chunk of words. The contribution that we did is following McDonald's and Lundgren in finance, with clustering in different type of words. So it's by analogy. These guys, Lundgren and McDonald, what they did is, look, they published a paper in the Journal of Finance where what they did is a dictionary of the 5% more frequent words that appear in filings. Not rocket science, just a dictionary of the 5% more frequent words that appear in US filings. So they were the first to count words, to say, oh, this is the 5% more often, without the DA of, the true words. And they made a dictionary of those. And these guys are studied over and over. And then they make the classification of positive words, negative words, modal positive, modal negative. And by the same token, what we did is, words is not only one category of words. Let's try to put it into categories so that we teach the computer how to analyze the dictionaries. Now, what Daniel was saying is something called the Bayesian learning. Bayesian learning is done in the capital market with news. So you have a bunch of news that appear over and over in time, and you see the reaction of the markets. So by the reaction of that news, the computer learns, this is the good news, this is the bad news, good news, bad news. And then you can anticipate. News X appears. Is it good or bad? It's good. The markets go up, so we have to invest. So you first teach the computer, but there is also a certain ex ante that is not totally Bayesian, because you have to teach the computer what is a good reaction of the market and a bad reaction of the market. Right? So you are saying, giving directions to the learning, but it's somehow more dynamic. Here we don't have, first, we are not in a frequently traded market, so this is not done per second. This is one every quarter. So you don't have to teach very dynamically the computer. And second is, it's more reliable. So this is an expert approach. Say, the lawyers know better than a randomly run learning on contracts, on news. Because here we don't have news, we have just only contracts appearing. So this is our base regression specification, where we test for the length of the contracts, the rigidity clauses, and the amendments, given two categories. One, a utility contract and a quasi-utility. And the benchmark is a non-utility, not quasi-utility. And a utility, these are traded companies, so we don't have public contracts. But the utility is the closer, I think, is to a public contract, because they are subject to more public scrutiny.
I'm sure you have a robustness check on this, but it seems weird to just do a word count in something like a contract, because if you go back to the slide, I could construct a sentence that says, there will be no damages or fines if you break this contract, which is a very flexible contract rather than a very rigid contract.
Yes, but people are not stupid. So they don't build that sentences into a contract just to have the word count.
Really? You don't put negative sentences in the contracts?
Yeah. One thing that you may argue that is very characteristic, look, the word whereas, and Schwartz and Watson show that the word whereas is very specific, it's a very specific arbitration word. So, I haven't done that, but there are more sophisticated techniques where you can also measure the distance of each word to each other. So to avoid that kind of double modal negative, it would be a way to do it. But with that large amount of contracts, it would take forever to read them. So you just read if somewhere appears the word settlement, is not because we don't want to settle.
Well, you might be building a settlement, right? You might be building a settlement.
Yes, and but it appears that there is a clause of settlement. Whatever, if the word settlement appears, it's not that you don't want to settle, it's that you somehow want to settle. And this is what we are trying to capture, that there is a clause about settlement.
So the clause should not be settlements. We will never settle.
Yes, exactly. We'll never settle.
I'm just saying, you could be building a settlement if you have
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, but there is. In another case, there isn't a settlement clause. So the idea is there a settlement clause, you will have the word settlement, or a synonym of that word. But if it doesn't appear, it will be very rare that or the other way around. If it appears, it wouldn't be rather the case that it says, we don't want to settle. It is because you want to have a clause that says something about settlement.
Mike has a question. you go first. I'll ask so many questions.
So I was wondering about the nature of the sample. So clearly this is not all the contracts.
No.
So two sub-questions of that. First of all, are there oral contracts in the US, or are they all written?
Mike, may we leave that question to the end when we go into the limitations?
Okay.
Because absolutely you're addressing two key issues. To what extent the sample is balanced or unbalanced?
Yeah, that's what
Absolutely.
I was wondering.
Absolutely. The short pitch is an analysis of something is better than the analysis of nothing. So here we have large numbers of contracts. Hopefully the sample is unbalanced, but unbalanced somehow normally. So let's look into our results. What we find here is that utility contracts, and utility is a proxy for a more public contract, and this is given by the SIC code, the SIC code, and the SIC code is between 1,000 and 9,900, and the public utilities are in the four category, in the fourth. So it's between the codes that are between 4,800 and 4,900 are utilities, and contracts and codes between 4,000 and 4,500 are quasi-utilities. A quasi-utility is, for instance, if I remember correctly, TV, cable TV, and water and sewage is a utility. So we find that contracts that are utilities are lengthier than non-utilities and non-quasi-utility contracts. Also, we find that quasi-utility contracts are not lengthier. And we use an OLS and a logit, the reverse of logit, but it gives the same results. Controlling for material contracts, so without the consulting contracts, without employment contracts, just only for items that are bought, more material contracts that we are interested in. Excluding also short contracts, so whatever is the low 10%. A 2-page contract may be just only a letter, so to exclude a letter saying that we'll have coffee next week, we just exclude the very short contracts because we don't know what is in there. Sometimes it's a letter, sometimes it's just a refinement of one word, so we want to exclude that out. And also controlling for 1-digit industry code. Later, what we did is, okay, let's check the rigidities, the clauses. So the left-hand side variable is a particular clause. So how more often, and this is a frequency, of appearance of an arbitration. So it's divided by the length. We already showed that the public contracts are lengthier. Now let's see if the frequency of appearance is also higher for those clauses. And what we find is that arbitration clauses appear more frequent, evaluation clauses, litigation, and termination clauses. Interestingly, and that goes to Sasha's point, certification doesn't appear to be significant. It means certification is when to provide this public work, you have to be certified. And that may be the way you tailor your procurement. If I put a lot of certification, it means, oh, you cannot procure that work, it's only for you. But we do not find significance here. We only find significance in certain clauses that are related to that rule base, to that bureaucratic approach. In quasi-utilities, we only find significance in arbitration, litigation, and termination. But the quasi-utilities were just as a fine-tuning. I'm more interested in the utilities versus non-utilities, non-quasi-utilities. Also, we find that amendments, Pablo said, my co-author Pablo Spiller, that this is probably the most interesting result. That amendments appear to be more frequent in utilities. So amendments, if I pick up randomly an amendment, it's more probable that that amendment is from a public utility than it's from any other industry. The story that I would say is not because other contracts are not renegotiated. It's because other contracts are renegotiated relationally over the phone. And here, what I do is I have to write it down and to amend and to tell the public that I'm doing so, because I am accountable to the third parties. Remember that what I want to minimize is not the contracting cost. I want to minimize the contracting cost and also the political costs.
It's somewhat double-edged, though, isn't it? I mean, having a lot of amendments could indicate either that you have to write everything down every time something is changed, or it could indicate that they're more flexible. They're willing to be more flexible and change it. Yeah, how do you decide between the two?
I'm not worried about flexibility. Mm-hmm. I'm worried how that flexibility is.
But you're just assuming there's flexibility in the other contracts.
No, what I'm assuming is rules-based. So what I'm assuming is a public contract. I'm signaling probity by making it explicit, more rigid in the terms. Here, what you are suggesting is something very interesting, which is it's not that I am trying to avoid renegotiation. What I am trying to avoid is the political risk of a renegotiation. I'm being misread that renegotiation was opportunistic. So the way that I signal that is I formalize the renegotiation in an amendment, in a formal amendment. So this is my reading of the story of more frequent. Also what we find is that within the amendments, arbitration clauses appear more often. Okay, you seem to buy this story very simply. But think of it that before that, we didn't have any knowledge what is in the contracts. And now you can read thousands of documents, and at least we can discuss if that clause appears more often or less often. We can discuss if some words should be retailored or my dictionaries are correct. Maybe the way I teach the computer is wrong, but at least now we're in a different, with this technique that you can apply to your own also stuff.
Well, I have
a
question specifically about that. Did anyone apply this kind of methodology to, for example, divorce contracts or
default contracts?
Divorce.
Divorce.
Yes, or to default proceedings of companies?
Well,
Has it happened?
You can apply to whatever you want. I don't have a story. Here, my core advantage is I have a story to tell with absolutely. Now, if you have a story to tell about divorce, and you can control about groups, and you have the documents, a library of documents, boom, can be done very easily.
It has been done to study the minutes of monetary policy committee meetings to see how that affects rates. And there's certain words apparently that encourage higher rates and so on, or can predict higher rates.
That's very interesting. So what I did, but
high frequency trading machines, also the NLI news.
Yeah. So what we did with a group of people is we surveyed 2,000 people that filed for divorce in the court. We followed them over time, and we scanned all the contracts. And for default, so we have this Chapter 11 proceedings in Belgium, and they changed the law by putting in more credit protection, and we have 1,000 files before and after. We didn't, but it's still just a scan. It's not a data set yet, but we don't know what to do with it really.
Well, we can talk later on.
Maybe we should talk.
Because this is, with PDFs, it's very simple.
It's PDFs,
to done by the computer, and OCR. OCR is how you transfer a PDF into
is that
readable.
optical character recognition?
Yes.
Is that? Okay.
So, but it is done automatically. You don't have to scan them.
Excellent.
The computer will scan them. Of course, you may have mistakes that sometimes the typical FI is read as another character, but all in all, because you have thousands of words.
So we even have, so in these default things, the votings on the plan and all that shit.
Well, then you may, if you know a little bit of linguistics, you can twist to put a joker character. A character that can absorb. This is the way I will show you also some projects I did in France. I don't know, I speak very little French. And for sure I don't know how to code in ASCII a French accent. So whenever I see a French accent, I put a joker character that can take whatever it is between the two, and it's doable. Okay, what is the next stage? Is to see if the contracts are more rigid, the public contract than private. It also be true that wherever you have more political contestability, contracts should be also more rigid. Because if the public authority is very confident in their place, it doesn't matter if I am a public or a private, because nobody is going to control me. Accountability doesn't matter. Accountability only matters, the signaling effect of rigidity, when I do have more of a political contestable market. So the next stage is to check for exactly the same hypothesis that contracts will be lengthier, will have more rigid clauses, and will have more amendments, the more the public authority is subject to public scrutiny through a political competitive market. So if the markets are very narrow, I will signal my probity through a contract that is very rigid. The way you can measure the contestability of a market is by swings in the parties in the last elections, swing squares. We also apply measures of margins, so the distance between the winning party and the runner-up, a margin dummy. So if the winning is more than 10%, that's a non-contestable, and if it's less than 10%, it's contestable. This is a typical threshold used by political scientists. Also, you can do IO's measures related to the political markets the same way as John was using the Herfindahl of the parties. So what if you have, like in the US, you only have 2 parties, 3 sometimes, 4 very rarely. But in France, you may have in municipalities 13 lists running in the first round. So how do you compute how contestable the market is? Well, the same way we do it in IOs, by Herfindahl. So it's different if the winner has 50% and the rest have only just a tiny 5%, than if all the parties have 20%. or 10%. This is more contestable than in the other case. So I'm constructing a data set by countries and by states, and to show, I mean, this is not to show the numbers, but how different states. California is not contestable though, it's democratic. Pennsylvania is a little bit contestable, but Wisconsin is it's a swinging state. So it changes very often and the margins are narrow. By any measure, you can capture that this is more contestable. So the prediction would be that this work still to do, but in sample, in political, in public utility contracts, Wisconsin will have more rigid contracts than California. So here we go into the biases. One that was mentioned by Mike is, are these samples, do we have all the contracts? It is unclear to what extent the SEC filings contain all the contracts, all the relevant contracts that the companies sign. It seems that it is not all the contracts, just only they disclose part of their contracts. Some that are very significant, but some other not necessarily. So it's a very unbalanced, study. Also, in our theory in our theoretical paper with Pablo, it is public versus private contracts. And here we do not have purely public contracts. It's a utility contract. It's as close as you can get it to a public contract, but it's not a public contract. Also, the way you word may vary by districts. By Louisiana, for instance, has contract law closer to civil law than New York, which is more of a UK law. Louisiana was part of the French colonies in the past, and they kept certain tradition of a civil law. So that the wording of the contracts may vary also by jurisdictions.
Can I suggest another limitation or potential limitation? You know, when you look at contracts, and I have to some extent, for example, on franchises, the contract has, in a sense, two parts. One part is the actual, there's like maybe a page or so of which is specific, and then there's all this sort of crap that goes on for pages and pages, which is the same every time. So how do you deal with that?
Well,
in other words, it's repeated each time. It's the same.
Absolutely, but if it's repeated, you will not find more frequent words, because if the difference, the variability of the words will come in the first word. So the constant will capture all what is common to the constant. The length the same. I mean, what you are saying, what you are saying is that they are both lengthier, but just only one page varies in the content. Yeah. But this is not what we find. I mean, the contracts are lengthier. I mean, the evidence is showing that they are lengthier. Minimally, but they are lengthier. The font size. No, but this is by word. It's not by page. Well, it's done not exactly by word, but it's done by file. In this case, it's done by the count of characters. In another paper that I will show, is done. We counted the most frequent words in English. So D, of, and A, and they then made geometric average of those words. So number of D squared, number of A squared, number of squared, the root of it. So this by saying, this is a measure of how often they appear. They are normally distributed. Normally people don't speak like, they speak with special lawyers. So this will be another way of doing it. You can do it also by file length. Different measures, but you can capture the length. So let me show in the next 20 minutes 4 projects that are involved with, and it gives you a flavor of what you can test and how powerful this technique is. I mean, the theory of public versus private, including the modern law, and how you can test. So one is the first one is, it's about asset pricing. And it's saying that corporations are also quasi-political markets. So it's different to have one shareholder than to have 1,000 shareholders. And the way we do that is by a Herfindahl of the ownership concentration. And it's also different to have only one project in the company or to have many projects as an investor. If I am an investor that have only one project, I will behave differently than if I have invested in 10 companies. By doing this matrix 2 by 2, ownership concentration and portfolio concentration, we can have the classic company that is a diversified portfolio and diversified ownership. But this is the classic textbook. But what happens when ownership concentration goes bigger? You have holdings. Means that you have one company that is the owner of the other companies, and they have diverse projects. They have a diversified portfolio. If you go from very concentrated, very diverse ownership, but very high in portfolio, you have activists, meaning that you may have a lot of shareholders, but those shareholders only have one share of your company, and they will fight like tigers for that company. And whereas you have high concentration of portfolio and ownership, you have family companies. I mean, my business, this is my business, I'm totally devoted to it. And the way they communicate with their constituencies will be different. So by reading the filings in this classification, you may retroact how the managers communicate with their constituencies, with their shareholders, depending on their type. Make sense? The second one, it's a very nice project with only 3,000 contracts, but which addresses specifically that balancing of contracts. So what we have here is parking spots contracts in France from one contractor and different contractees. So the a car parking contract is it's as simple as you can get it. I mean, how a construction of a parking lot is very simple. The whole variance comes if the contractor is a private contractee. It means, for instance, Auchan or a large company that wants to have its own parking for clients. Or if it's a municipality. And within the municipalities, the more contestable they are. So what we did is, we read all the contracts in French. We clustered the words, and we put into that the political outcomes of the elections in municipalities. And we find the same patterns, that the clauses of arbitration, termination, litigation come more often for public contracts than to private contracts, and in the subsample of public contracts, they come more often when the municipalities are contested, are more politically more competitive. Another project I'm doing with a grad student at Berkeley is to analyze the bond market as a contract. So in the US, the bond market, the municipal bond market is huge. It's $4 trillion. Half of these contracts, more or less, are general obligation contracts. And half of the bonds are revenue contracts, revenue bonds. So a general obligation bond is give me the money for whatever project I may have, and I will pay you back from all the revenues of the municipality. A revenue bond is giving this money for this particular project, and I will pay you back from the revenues of this particular project. In contract per law, a general obligation bond is a long-term, flexible, incomplete contract. A revenue bond is a long-term, complete contract, more rigid. Question: is the choice of a revenue bond versus a general obligation bond driven also by the political characteristics of the municipality? So the more contested you are, you will choose a revenue bond both to signal probity, but also to restrict the funds that the potential incomer may have in the use of funds. Because if my constituencies care more about roads, and you care more about schools, if I devote the money for the roads, you will have less money for the schools. So we took 6,500 bond issues, and we merged with the political outcomes of 400 municipalities. And we find evidence, small but still like 5% of the probability of choosing a revenue bond is given by the political characteristics of the municipalities. Well, 5%, you can buy any day of the week, right? Explanatory power, 5% of the choice. So this is also how you can use that political mindset into a very finance choice. All the finance literature would tell you that, I mean, it's about the project characteristics. If it's very risky, you take the choice is given by the characteristics of the municipality and the characteristics of the project, and then the financial characteristics of the municipality. Here is controlling for all those characteristics. What else can we learn? Is there a political story also behind that choice? And the last one is not very related to politics, but is related to the word count with an event study of the codes of conduct. So there are three major events that we have in financial law: the Sarbanes-Oxley, Basel II, and Dodd-Frank, and Basel III, which is very new. So we are testing which companies reacted more quickly in changing their codes of conduct after these events, and how close they mirror the wording of the law acts in their codes of conduct. So if the codes of conduct, if Dodd-Frank says, oh, you should behave very well in terms of governance, so I will write in my code of conduct, you should behave very well in your governance. So I'm just mirroring, and how quick I do it. Not necessarily I change my behavior, but I do opportunistically signal my changing in the code of conduct. And this can be done also by the same technique of reading the contract.
But are you interested in controlling for the real behavior?
I would love to do so. We are trying now to get some variables for risks or real behavior.
But there is a very simple...
Because this is the real story. To what extent I just only change the way I express myself in the code of conduct, and to what extent I change my behavior.
But there is something not many people know. Do you know Benford's law? Benford's law.
Yeah. No.
There is a statistical law about the frequency of numbers, digits, 0 and 2,
yes,
in reporting. And it's been shown to be a very good predictor. If your reporting deviates from the law, it's a very good signal of manipulation of the numbers. So if you are fraudulent, you start to fill out numbers, right? And so I don't know, let's put something in. But actually, the distribution of numbers is not random.
Yes,
it follows and certainly if you have a big amount of numbers. And fraudulent people, so for example, they did it for the Greek GDP numbers, and it came out very strongly. They've done it. I've done it for access to deposit insurance and bankrupt banks in Russia. It comes out very, very strongly. So people that manipulate, they do it in a stupid way. Of course, we shouldn't tell them. Let's keep the benefits law secret as long as we can. But so there's even a paper trying to do it for. So you have in banking, you have these loan applicant procedures, and so some people. So I go to apply for a loan. And there's an officer sitting, and he wants to grant me the loan for his bonus. So what he does, he types in, what is your annual wage? What is this? What is that? And then says, no. I said, shit, I want to sell this loan. And then he refills the application and starts to manipulate it to get a yes. And so there's data on the initial entry and the final entry. And just looking at the difference and applying Benford's law, you find it immediately. So something you could very easily apply if you have accounting data.
Yeah, what we were thinking in this project to do is to see measures of risk aversion. I mean, the Basel III applied in the past. I mean, retrospectively, how change their behavior before and after the law, and how they change their codes of conduct. And if there is a significant difference in the codes of conduct but no change in the behavior, you may say that this is a very opportunistic approach to the code of conduct. I just put it down because to keep you happy at the financial authority, but I'm not changing my way of doing business. Or to what extent my code of conduct is just an adaptation of the law into the code of conduct, or is my real concern. If you are just mirroring the new words that appear in the law into your code of conduct, this may be very opportunistic. But again, I'm trying to give you a flavor of what can be done in your research. This is very cutting edge. Now it's still very fresh, not many people doing it. In 3 years, it may be common. But still, you may have out papers with the simple word count and frequencies. As I show you, these two guys, Journal of Finance.
So let me elaborate a bit on the Benford's law. I'm the first person to publish an article using Benford's law in macroeconomics, in economics. And currently there is a new volume coming out from Princeton University Press surveying the literature on the use of Benford's law in all the social sciences. I am the author of the chapter on economics. And in addition, to give an example of how we used it as to demonstrate its use, what we did is we used the statistic for banks in America called value at risk. Banks in America are supposed to report the total value of risk numbers. And we found that until 2008, the value of risk numbers were perfectly Benford. Perfectly. I mean, they looked like a theoretical draw. I mean, after 2008, after the crisis, when the US increased regulation, the value at risk numbers ceased to be Benford. So it's a very good example, very good example. In addition, I can tell you that I got paid to consult with a bank in the Philippines, and I taught the president about Benford's law, and he had them check stuff by simply looking at the amounts of the checks, and he found a subset that was obviously deviate, and he suspected of check kiting and some other kinds of underhandedness. So he accused it at the whole board holders meeting, and the investigator found it was true. And he doesn't tell the board how he got it. He said it's a secret weapon. People think, he said people in the bank think that someone ratted out this guy. Rather than so the reward for this is I get to stay in a 5-star hotel in Manila every time I travel.
Are you also suggesting that Benford's law caused the financial crisis?
Only if Sebastian's here.
Well, this is all from my side. Now we can open the discussion to what extent this can be applicable to your findings. So, for instance, My reading of Olga's data set on the municipal choice of city managers against versus city politicians is that the choice I will have rather city politicians be more careful about the political risk, and in internalizing that they will go for more social projects expenditures than the city managers that will go more pro business as an internalization of the future political risk.
But I think it might be reversed because my story is that city manager, elected guys carry, they want to be good for local business, and local business somehow a bit look longer than city managers who cares only support of the ruling party, which is might be.
That's the data talk. I think that a politician is always short-term.
I'm not sure because yeah.
And then you have to have in sample. I mean, we talk about then in sample in the political in the city politicians. Those cities which are more contestable, they will have different patterns of behavior than city politicians with less contestable political markets.
Okay, we will talk, okay?
Can I offer a really strong critique of doing this kind of analysis?
Absolutely. And this is ongoing. I mean, the paper is still, I'm presenting it at NBER Summer Institute this year, and I don't have still done.
I actually really like your paper. It's just this kind of analysis lends itself to doing bad statistics. And the reason is that you create your own data. So what you do is you read the contract, you look for a bunch of words, and then you run 2 million regressions. You see what comes out, and you kind of spot a pattern, and you think, hey, that looks good, let's send that to QJE. And I know you didn't do that because, you know, the
QJE is the theoretical one.
Right, but well, you actually had a nice theory beforehand, which you actually, I think, wanted to test. But it lends itself to, I mean, it's not even data mining. I mean, it's data creation to do mining. And so it worries me because, you know, you really need to convince me that you had this hypothesis ex ante. And if you had a theoretical paper published before about this and then you tested this is great. But if you really just went out, created your data, found a pattern in the data, a lot of this is, you know, correlations.
Perfect. Show me what you're criticizing is this.
No, I'm criticizing that, you know, I could just read a contract.
You have a better bunch of words?
No, just don't get me wrong. You're looking at rigidity. Suppose I looked at some other aspect of contractual agreements, right? And I can create 50 boxes like this with 20 words each, run 1,000 regressions, and then see which ones seem to come out straight. Well,
do you have a story for those words?
No, but if I found something, I would come up with a story. Okay. I can come up with stories for a lot of things. Now, Marian, I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying you're pushing this method of analysis, and I'm saying that I would be very worried if everybody started doing this, because we would get a lot of papers with whatever type of error we get when we do that.
I mean, I can show you, I was a referee for a paper that came out in the Journal of Finance, which I think the paper was fantastically written, but they find, look at the following, that the mergers, before the mergers of companies, what sort of news the acquiring company pushes out in the market to lower or to increase the value of the company. And in that sense, to have a better relation. And they find that there was one of two more articles prior to the announcement of the merger that were significantly higher for companies doing a split. There are two types of acquiring the company, either by matching the price, I mean you acquire by the price, or one-to-one, or a relationship between the shares. And it was so small that you would say, that's one article with this kind of positive words in the Washington Post changes the valuation of the company, and the paper was published. And you must find that this is very exposed, you look ex ante, very insignificant, but still.
Marian, don't give students wrong ideas. The key is not to publish. The key is to publish good papers. I mean, if Journal of Finance is publishing shitty papers, that's too bad for Journal of Finance, but then you should not encourage people to publish shitty papers in the Journal of Finance, right? Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
What I'm just only trying to say is the task of the referees on you to challenge that. It's my job to push it as far as I can. And this is how the justice system works in the US.
I don't accept that. That's what's evil.
That's what?
That's evil.
That's evil, but that's where it works. I mean, you have a very strong feeling about theory and a framework, and I'm trying to find ways to justify it or to empirically test it. Maybe I'm wrong in the set of words I'm using, maybe I'm wrong in the sample of contracts I'm using, maybe I'm other alternative hypotheses or stories that I am assuming of or resiliency, but it's up to the other parties to show it up. So far, I don't have a better data set. I mean, the French contracts is very strong because it's very particular. It's one industry, one contractor, many contractees, and all the variance goes into the public-private and in sample public. With the US contract, my feeling is that it's better to have some credibility in large data than just saying, oh, we cannot test it. One thing that Scott Maston, looking at this paper, suggested is you don't have the counterpart flexibility words. For instance, good faith, timely, some words that would say more flexible. So that's a way to look into the counterpart. Then you can make a measure of A minus B divided by A plus B, whatever. But these by the same token, we can refine the dictionaries. We can make the computer read better. What you are saying is, oh, you are not reading correctly. Your computer is still stupid. But word analysis is the way to go.
So the reason I do believe your paper is because you checked it on the French data. And that's the only thing that makes the entire exercise valid, is that you went and you did the same exercise on an external data set with the same hypothesis and it was confirmed. That's good. But how many people are you going to do that? If suddenly everybody gets this technique, I mean, I'm scared of what's going to happen.
What is going to happen is that we'll have a confirmation or not if politics matter. Because you will see that another data that is interesting is Pakistan. I was presenting this paper and a guy from Pakistan said, oh, we are doing it from LSE. So this guy from LSE is doing an experiment in Pakistan where they buy a very simple item. I can't remember if it's a pen or whatever. And it seems to be that the contracts vary across municipalities where it's a very simple item. And they were testing for different characteristics of the municipalities. And I suggest, and he said, whoa, that's a very nice explanation because it may be driven by the political characteristics, not the characteristics, the geographic or economic characteristics, but the political characteristics of the municipality.
Yeah, well, in linguistics they have what they call gold standards. So they have texts and they have an attribute that they would like to check. So they let the so-called annotators read this text at least 3 persons because they need to have a consensus value for each text item. And then when they have enough texts, they have the gold standard. Okay, so they have the text for which all the annotators agree, and then they test the technique, for instance, automatic text mining, the kind of you did here, and then they can check how well the technique matches the gold standard. Okay, in this text, in this case, you can, for example, let several experts read several hundreds of contracts and define them whether they are rigid in your sense or not. And it would be also nice when you could take the contracts for which you exactly know that they have to do with this public procurement. In that case, you can guarantee that your test is more or less fitting what you're aiming at fitting.
Well, we have the opinion of 2 lawyers, not 3, but 2 lawyers on the words. But absolutely, one way to go is with the French contracts, which are only 3,000. We did it more to read that, some of them large and wide, to see if they differ the public and private, and whether. But absolutely, that what he's suggesting is to do for a small sample a check, and then you extrapolate on the large sample.
One thing I'm wondering is to what extent, if you use this technique, should we be testing hypotheses, or should we rather use it to establish stylized facts? Because it's complete new. So what I like about the methodology, contrary to maybe John and Sasha, is that these things are essential. We make plenty of models about them, we talk about them in our courses, but you have no idea about what really happens, because we don't see through the bunch of contracts. This offers a technique to look at it and to establish what is the stylized fact here. Is anyone using it in this way, just trying to, so that's actually establishing correlations and just saying, look, these are strange patterns we find. Should we maybe now think about a theory that explains this, the other way around?
Lawyers have been using textual analysis, but only on particular contracts, not on large samples. But don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to push a technique too far. What I'm trying to get is tests for a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that politics matters, and politics internalize in the way you contract. So 2 municipalities will contract differently for the same item if one is contested and the other is a dictatorship-like municipality. This is my hypothesis. And believe me, I was a politician at once. I was in a political high level government position, and politicians or political appointees do care about the aftermath. You don't want to go to jail. You want to cover your ass. And the way you do it is you are very careful about the way you contract. If you are just a manager, it's my money. I mean, or it's the money of the company. And if it's a totally private company, you don't care. If it's a corporation, you may care about being kicked out, but that's a quasi-political market, because the shareholders are the voters. So if there are no shareholders, or there is only one shareholder, you don't care. If you are politically contestable, if you are contestable by other constituencies, and a political market is by definition that, you care about the aftermath. Not losing reputation, not using your political capital, not going to jail. And the way you signal that credibility is by clauses that do not make it more efficient, but reduce the political risk. But that additional cost is externalized to all the public at large in taxes. So I'm not paying the full price. I'm free riding on the guys.
I wanted to defend both Marianne and agree with Kuhn to some extent. That is one of the things Coase complained about, is there's not enough induction in economics. As for the problem of misusing the technique, I hate to say this, but as somebody who's a senior faculty member and seen the profession for 30 years, I would argue that's a story of the profession. That is to sort of say, I don't think Marianne is actually much more careful. In fact, I would argue that in my lifetime, everything from game theory to IV to RDD to the latest whiz-bang has always been abused. That is to sort of say, I think that there are, at this very moment, I could point to hordes of famous papers in the top 4 journals which suffer from abuse of historical context, misuse of technique, that very often what you see in the profession is you'll see a kind of bandwagon effect where there's going to be the technique du jour, and then it has to be robust to the preferences of the elite about what are important margins. But on margins that they don't consider important, they can be abusive in all sorts of dimensions. Conversely, other papers which are actually better and richer, but do not use the technique du jour, fall below their threshold of acceptable rigor, and then they're never published. So that's exactly what Coase was offended by. And so that, in fact, I would argue that very often, a good exploratory paper that's pure induction, that's in fact almost shoot from the hip, if it's well thought out enough, and if it's careful and does not overclaim, is a very deep and profound contribution, as long as they don't make overclaims. However, as we know, the majority of top journals, in fact, the majority of mid-level journals, will desk reject such a paper. And in fact, I would argue the reason you have abusive use of, say, hypothesis tests is precisely because authors feel they have to shoehorn their work into a particular form. We know in medicine, for instance, there's a lot of bias about, there's a jump at around 95% confidence because of what it takes to publish paper. One of the interesting things is that PLOS ONE is, I believe, the only major science journal now that claims that if your experimental or methodological setup is valid, and if your question is valid, and if you can justify it as an important question, they will publish negative results. Because the claim is that if you really care about science, you should be asking, what is the setup, what is it? But in fact, they're the only journal that will do that. Try getting that into AER or Econometrica. And that, I think this is one of the issues. But I think in that sense, Marianne is doing it right. But I think I agree with you that there's going to be this temptation to abuse it. But I don't see that as particularly different from RDD or RCT or game theory. I still remember how annoyed I was in graduate school when a famous speaker gave a talk and the students critiqued it later, and it was clear that empirics was bad and the theory was good. Roger Myerson defended it by sort of saying, well, we've seen so many papers with good empirics and bad theory. It's nice to see one with theory and bad empirics.
The Roland Coase Institute is the one running the project on the Cori database, just posting all the contracts online. The problem with that data set is you can download only one by one. Here, with this extracting technique from the web, you can extract all of them. I think Sophia has.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you about using the topic modeling toolkit. Did you think about it? Because
the what modeling?
Topic modeling toolkit, because it was used for comparisons the agendas of politicians before election and after election. Guys from Stanford, I suppose, they clustered their I don't know, the talks or something like this, the stenograms of politicians before and after elections, and they used
that.
Yeah, and they compared it, and they found completely different agendas. And I think that it can be also this technique can also be applied for your research.
Absolutely, I haven't done that. I don't have a story what it may happen, because just documenting that they speak differently before and after, it's not enough to get a story. Now, if you have a story, I think I have a story to explain the difference here. Maybe that is opportunistic behavior, and you have an different the timing. And then my approach is more first have a nice story and then test it. What Sasha was saying, no, you should first look into the data and then build up the story from the data. What is first, the chicken or the egg? It's still an open question. I think both are valid as long as at the end they merge, that the story is congruent with the data and the data with the story, both will converge into one. I'm more of an applied theorist than come to empirics to test theories than an empiricist that try to understand the data, the raw data that is out there. Both are valid. I don't have a story for what Sophia, what you are saying, what it changed. But if you have that in that context, these politicians change more than other, I mean, the way that they change, this is obvious. But why did they change more than less? If you can find the algorithmic data reading, which is very simple and I can show you how it works, you can test it. And you can create your own data set. And then, for instance, you can measure the distance by two ways. Let me finish with this. Imagine that we are just testing two dimensions, arbitration and certification. And this is before and this is after. So one way of saying it, the difference is the distance between these two vectors, I mean the points, to measure. Just a Cartesian distance between two. But the second is the angle. You can say to what extent that change. And now you can think of it in a multidimensional, right? We can do it for n whatever. To what extent that vector changes from point to point, the distance, but also a relative measure of how it changes the angle between the categories. So that's another why using categories instead of one synthetic measure. I don't like, I mean, one of my criteria was, let's make a one measure of rigidity. We sum, we delete, we split, and we have a measure. No, one measure is not instructive. What we want to have is the different categories, I think. There was some other question.
I'm sorry to interrupt the discussion, but we are really run out of time. Thank you very much, Marian.